British public want a royalty. They want a royalty this size. I much prefer the Norwegian, the Dutch, Swedish model, small, contained, ceremonial. Great. But I simply do not see that we all want these sons and daughters and everybody else being paid huge amounts of taxpayers' money, and some of them have no regard for the common taxpayer. And when we're putting pensioners on £90 a week, and you see these spoilt individuals on many thousands a week for doing very little, it grates. And I've been fairly vociferous in my comments, and certainly asking for a total grown-up review. But of course, no Commissioner, no Home Secretary, none of them, Labour, Conservative, will really ever tackle the problem. And that's an issue in my opinion. But you go back to basics, and again, they're armed, and by the time I got there, I tried to make everybody armed, because when I was there, half and half were. And in order to enhance the fitness, and by that time I was a fitness fanatic, I could run marathons standing on my head. I wanted everybody, and I felt, rightly or wrongly, that if you're protecting the Queen, everybody should be fit, from the lowest to the highest. And from the top down, we should set the example. Of course, I was only in my early 40s. It's very easy for me to dictate it, and of course some of them were younger and some older, and some of them hadn't been fit for years. So not everybody loved me, but I felt it was an essential ingredient. I won't go into some why, but you know, we failed on a number of occasions, which the public have never got to hear, and royals could have been put at risk by the failure. So I insisted that it was an armed unit, insisted on bringing discipline, smartness back. They would salute me. They'd forgotten how to stand up and salute when a senior officer walked in. It's discipline. Excuse me. And in a kind of discipline, the police now have lost discipline. So many areas. But I felt in a core subject area, you had to restore. If I say jump, you jumped. And there are many instances where it proved very valuable that we don't have a debate. You do it, because I tell you. And I wasn't older, but I was certainly wiser. And I was paid to be the boss, so I'm not a huge Democrat in that sense, although I believe in listening to everybody's point of view. But we've had threats when the IRA and others were, we had intelligence. You can't have a debate on this issue. And they paid me because prior in my other life, I was one of the architects of combating the IRA for London, so I wouldn't beg a discussion too often from people who had no knowledge.
Gosh, while we're in the subject of protecting royalty, were there any narrow escapes?
Yes.
How many?
Quite a few. Quite a few. Which I won't go into.
Sure.
Positive.
We're having this conversation, Di, round about the time that Prince William and Katie Middleton are getting engaged, or have got engaged. How do you go about protecting them? Because they're due to come and live in Anglesey, aren't they?
I have commented on the media on this, and certainly when the taxpayers of North Wales would be deprived of North Wales policemen in order to provide a permanent squad for him, I was outraged. One, it shouldn't come out the taxpayers of North Wales, it shouldn't come from the Home Office if you're going to do it. The other reason is the numbers they were doing, and the fact that they were denuding men and women from the streets in North Wales. I think it was right, and I felt the numbers were silly. And again, you know, I have this problem. If the Royals want protection, and they want to live off base, because he's an RAF officer, and he wants to bring his then girlfriend with him, and all the rest of it, and they want to have lovely, well, you start to say, well, you either do it properly, and somebody funds it properly, or you don't do it at all. And sometimes we have a mismatch. Now, William is a nice guy, but he has a privileged position. He is the future heir, but it costs you and I a huge amount. And I'm not sure 2 plod from North Wales will keep a determined terrorist out anyway. So you really got to say, why are we doing it? Are we doing it right? And so on and so forth. So I have a number of questions which I constantly wrestle. But at the end of the day, the British public want a monarchy. There is a threat out there. He is a serving officer. So by risk criteria, he deserves protection, but it's so expensive. I've got to do it. I'd have him living on the army base or the RAF base. And if he wants to be a flying officer or lieutenant, well, be a flying officer and lieutenant. But don't expect us, taxpayers, to go to these huge expenses, $1 million plus a year, just because he wants to live in a farmhouse.
Do you have any contact with the royal
No,
family?
no,
None
no.
at all. Did you, when you were actually running it from London,
Yes.
actually face-to-face contact with them?
Not very often. You delegate that to these close protection who they know, they trust. Until Inspector Worf wrote his book about Diana, that's the way. I mean, I obviously have met them all, but on formal occasions, and so has my wife, and you go to things. But no, on a day-to-day basis, I phoned the superintendent, or he'd phone me, and really I was a backdoor Johnny. And often people say, well, you were just the admin. Well, I can assure you I wasn't the admin. But no, if you saw me, then they were in the shit. And on occasions I'd put my uniform on and walk around looking ever so important. At least I thought. And on state occasions and things, I would put on a uniform. And at night, if I was patrolling or on Christmas Day, I'd always go in, see people and wish them Happy Christmas. And do all the posts, that sort of thing, you know. Probably thought, silly old bugger. Why does he stay at home?
You did hint that in the end the pressure got to you.
Yes.
What did you then do?
Well, I retired. I wasn't given a choice. I went to see a very nice chief medical officer who sent me to see a variety of different people. I forgot to tell you, I have a broken spine. I've been attacked a few times. So amongst being attacked, and the pressure, when I get stressed, the pain in my neck got intense. And I've been hit in the head many, many times. And a combination of the injuries I received, being this stroppy little Welshman, really hits you, and it still does. I don't get very stressed these days. I try not to. But when it's stressed, the neck goes, and I can't move. I'm paralysed almost. And I'm very lucky not to have been paralysed. So anyway, so that's a combination and the family factors. So I took 3 or 4 months, and I was approached by a number of companies, including a big one in America. But I thought I'd have a little rest to see my wife. That was nice. And my family, which most of my career hadn't hugely seen a lot of them. And sadly, the first 2 boys certainly grew up hardly ever seeing me. So I bitterly regret that. But, you know, the other 2, the daughter and my other son, I saw a bit more of those. So I realised. But anyway, so, yeah, there's been a lot of pressures. And then because of me, I couldn't say no, I took on a political role, and that gives you pressure. Instead of having the days that I did occasionally have off, I was going to conferences and speaking and opening my big mouth as usual and tackling things. And I became very involved in the firearms side of things. I went to Dunblane after the children were killed there, because I was the representative of firearms. And I then became involved in trying to coordinate action against armed criminals in this country, because as usual we were years behind. And in the meantime I'd go off to America and places like that, and Japan. I was going to look after the Emperor of Japan when he came here, so I managed to get an invite to Japan and saw things in Japan, which became very interesting because I then, in my other life as a detective, private, went out and investigated Lucy Blackman, who was murdered in Japan. And Jane Blackman, the mother, has become a very great friend of ours, and she's coming up this Christmas and does every Christmas and New Year to stay with us, and we've become really bosom pals, which has been a great privilege because she's an extraordinary woman. And I suppose that's the great thing of what I do. I help people when they're in trouble. And I get a huge relief. I love helping people. I'm not a Christian, but I just like that Christian ethics of doing something and giving something back.
Well, we've covered an awful lot of ground there, Di. You've also covered a lot of ground, actually, physically, haven't you? Let's move into other areas. Terrorism, arms control, subversive people. I mean, the list is endless.
Well, it is like endless, and I almost sound as a sort of jack of all trade and master of none. But let's go to the arms. Well, I worked in Jamaica. I was asked by the Jamaican government to go over some years ago now to look at how we could try and tackle the huge criminality and the armed criminality. And so that's when I started to get involved in this huge aspect of how guns are shipped around the world from east to west and all the rest of it. That's how I got involved in guns and all the rest of it. And the crime and the drug correlation, and to be a good drug dealer you need firearms. And of course the world is awash with firearms, particularly with the Cold War coming down. So that's where the firearms stuff. And then they've got to launder the money into fraud. So one of my close associates is the ex-head of our computer crime and fraud section, so we do a lot of work with that. the subject areas I often put out to other people because I've got several companies I'm either the director or an associate director of, and so we do a range of things, but I bring in people. If I feel it's too complex a crime for me to investigate, then I bring in an expertise. And that's why we've moved into crisis and been over in America and have now an associate American company where we're looking at crisis and disaster and trying to learn the lessons from around the world, the good practices, so we can use them in our own crises and disasters. And that's why with the protests we've had, I'm writing a piece to say, well, how would I tackle, and you talk, how would I tackle? And really you look at the basics and then look at what you need to tackle. Well, you need information. We call information intelligence, which is graded information. Intelligence and information is how you set your strategy. You look at the geography of the ground you're trying to defend. You look at the resources that you have to defend it. You look at the special units that you can bring to assist you as the commander or those in charge, and a combination. And more importantly, you look at your vulnerabilities, and then you go on to look at what if. So you try and imagine, what if this happened, and how would I react to that? And going back to the protection of the Queen, that's what I found lacking quite often, is the what if. And what I've learned in my 43 years of being what I am is that what if is the crucial. And therefore, whilst if you have a plan for going forward, always have a plan for turning left or right, or even going in reverse. And that's what they didn't do the other day. The planning was poor. They had no contingency plan.
This is the student riots in London.
Well, that and the attack on Charles and Diana, which is the focus of them. Camilla, sorry, Freudian slip. And she was nice, by the way. I liked Diana. And I was in charge when she died, by the way.
Were you?
That's another
No, tell me about it.
claim to fame. Well, it's open for record, my evidence at the hearing. And as I often said, I was high enough to take the blame, but low enough not to get my OBE. I'm still waiting for that. I don't think sticking my finger up my boss's nose and calling him part of a female anatomy helped that cause.
Ah.
Somehow, do you?
No.
Anyway. And but I enjoyed doing it.
What?
And, anyway, I only got a little finger, it didn't hurt much. Well, anyway, I don't think he forgave me. Anyway, so yeah, so being serious again. It's a.
What happened with Diana? Finish that.
Well, Diana died in an accident,
Yeah,
and it was an
where
accident
were you
from start
involved?
to finish. Well, I was sleeping in my bed, having just come back from Crete, and I'd been to a birthday party, and I was quite sozzled. And then the phone goes, and they said, "It's for you, dear." I say, "We're in Crete. Tell them to phone Roger, my deputy." And they said, "No, you're not in Crete." So you have this instant ability, I'm sure as a journalist, you know this feeling, you can wake up fairly quick and sober up. So I went downstairs, picked up the phone, we lived in Shepperton then. And they said, "Governor, Dodie's dead and Diana is not in too good." So I got the story at about 1 in the morning, whatever it time, just minutes after it happened. So I phoned my then boss, who lived across the water in Walton, and I must have been still way over, but I jumped in my car, I can't remember my car or his car, put the blue lights and two tones, and off we went through every red light from, anyway. So we get there, whatever time it was, 2 in the morning thing, and we sort of looked, so...
Get where?
To Buckingham Palace, or the police office, and we put the kettle on, which is always a good thing to do in an emergency. Too early to start drinking anyway. Slowly but surely the world came upon, and very interestingly, I went up to Balmoral and I briefed. I didn't have an audience with the Queen, but I did with her protection officer. And I said, "Look, it's looking pretty not damn good down there, boy, and you better let them know." And no one said, anyway. So that was done, and but I've got to tell you, this is an interesting one. I actually told Her Majesty not to let the two princes go on holiday with Fayed, because Fayed at that time was being a crook. And it's very interesting. It's an interesting story, because at the hearing, I told this to the inquest, and the commissioner, now Lord Condon, denied that one I had ever told him this information.